This happened a few years ago, back in the winter of 2022. I was 25, working a high-stress tech job, and completely burned out. I desperately needed to get out of the city, even if just for a weekend. I found what looked like the perfect spot on Airbnb, a secluded cabin deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, covered in snow. The photos showed it nestled in a silent, snow-laden forest, and the reviews were all glowing. Peaceful, serene, the perfect winter escape. The host's name was Robert. His profile picture showed a smiling, silver-haired man, and in our messages, he seemed warm and helpful. I drove up on a Friday afternoon. The further I got into the mountains, the deeper the snow became. The air was frigid and clean, a world away from the city grime. The cabin itself was even more charming than the photos, with a huge picture window overlooking a snow-covered valley. I made a hot cup of coffee to warm my frozen hands, pulled out my laptop, but had no desire to work. I just sat there, watching the soft snowfall, feeling the tension in my shoulders finally begin to release. That night, I built a fire in the hearth and fell asleep to the sound of crackling wood, wrapped in the kind of heavy, insulated silence that only a deep snow can bring. It was a profound peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The next day, I bundled up and decided to walk a nearby trail Robert had recommended in the welcome guide. It was a typical winter day, the sky a flat gray, a total stillness over everything. About an hour into the hike, though, I started to get a strange feeling. You know the kind, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The sense that you're being watched. I'd stop and turn around, but there was nothing but snow-heavy pines and the endless white. My own footprints were the only tracks behind me. I laughed it off as city-dweller paranoia and kept going, but the feeling of being observed didn't leave me until I was back in the cabin with the door locked. That night, things started to feel wrong. I was making dinner when I heard a dragging sound from the porch. In the dead quiet of the snowy night, the sound was sharp, the noise of something heavy being scraped through the snow. I turned off the faucet and listened. Silence. I walked to the window and carefully peeked through a gap in the blinds. The heavy wooden Adirondack chair, which had been covered in snow and sitting far from the porch steps, had been moved. It was now positioned directly in front of my living room window, and the snow around it was disturbed, showing clear drag marks and a single set of footprints leading off into the dark woods. My heart sank. It couldn't have been the wind. I told myself maybe Robert had sent someone to check on the property, but I hadn't gotten any message. I forced myself to calm down and eat my dinner. As darkness fell completely, I drew all the curtains and turned on some music, trying to drown out the sound of my own increasingly loud heartbeat. That's when I heard it. The sound cut through the music, unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps in the snow on the porch. One step, then another, heavy and deliberate. Not an animal, a person. Fear washed over me like ice water. I killed the music, and the cabin fell silent. The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. I held my breath, frozen, staring at the door. After a few seconds, there was a faint metallic click from the doorknob, and then it began to turn, slowly and deliberately. My mind went blank, but my body moved on its own. I didn't scream or even think. I just backed away silently toward the kitchen and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet. The doorknob turned until it couldn't go any further, stopping with a soft thud against the deadbolt. A long silence followed. I felt like the person on the other side of the door was waiting, just like I was. Suddenly, a loud crash exploded from the living room window. Glass shattered, wood splintered, and a blast of freezing, snow-filled air rushed in. A tall figure in a dark hoodie clumsily climbed through the broken frame. He was large, but moved with an unnerving quietness. He straightened up, turned his head, and our eyes met. He was wearing a plain white mask, the cheap kind from a Halloween store, with no expression at all, just two black holes for eyes. He didn't say a word. He just started walking toward me. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. He didn't run. He just walked toward me with a steady, unhurried pace that was more terrifying than any rush. I screamed and threw the skillet with all my might. He just tilted his head, and it slammed into the wall next to him with a dull thud. I turned and ran. My only goal was the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. I could hear him right behind me, his heavy breathing seemingly at my ear. Just as my fingers brushed against the door handle, a hand tangled in my hair and yanked me backward. Pain exploded in my scalp, and I fell to the floor. He was on top of me, a cold, gloved hand clamping around my throat. I thrashed wildly, clawing at his arms, kicking my legs. The blank mask was getting closer, and through the eye holes, I could smell the cold scent of snow and sweat on him. Fueled by adrenaline, or maybe just the raw will to live, I slammed my knee into his groin as hard as I could. He grunted in pain, and his grip on my throat loosened for just a second. It was enough. I scrambled out from under him, crawled to the back door, tore it open, and ran out barefoot into the freezing night. The searing pain of the sharp, icy snow on my bare feet was instant, but I didn't care. I could hear him behind me, the crunch of his boots in the snow closing in. I didn't dare look back. I just ran blindly, downhill into the darkness, my lungs burning as if they were filled with ice. I don't know how long I ran before the sounds behind me finally faded. My feet were completely numb. I hid behind a large pine tree, shaking uncontrollably until the first light of dawn. Only then did I dare to stumble onto a road, where a driver on his way to an early shift found me, shivering and incoherent, my feet blue from frostbite. The police found the broken window, the skillet, and 2 sets of footprints in the snow, one chasing, one fleeing. But the intruder was long gone. They contacted the host, Robert, who sounded shocked and apologetic on the phone and promised to cooperate fully with the investigation. The case was eventually classified as a random, attempted break-in, likely because I was a woman traveling alone. But the most terrifying part came a month later. The police had no leads, and the case had gone cold. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself on the Airbnb listing again, morbidly looking at the place where my life almost ended. I clicked on Robert's profile. His picture was small and a little blurry. I'd never paid much attention to it before. I zoomed in. As the image cleared, my blood ran cold. There, on the right side of his neck, near his collarbone, were 3 parallel, faded red scratches. The scratches I had left with my own fingernails that night. He wasn't a random attacker. He was the host. He had the keys. He knew all my information. He knew I was alone. He wasn't trying to rob me. He was waiting for me. This happened 2 winters ago. That year, I decided to work from home, seeking a bit of peace. My desk faced a large window, overlooking a snow-covered backyard. Normally, I enjoyed watching the birds while I worked, but looking back, that window became the starting point of my nightmare. The nightmare began on a cold evening. I'd just finished a major company project and was leaning back in my chair, tidying up some files. I happened to glance out the window and saw a man standing there, right outside my house. He was wearing a dark hoodie and sweatpants. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thinking he was just someone out for a walk in the neighborhood. But soon, I noticed him stopping at the end of my driveway, staring intently at my window at me. The feeling was like a splash of icy water. A few days later, he grew bolder. I was at my computer working when I caught a glimpse of him in my peripheral vision. He was standing at the edge of my front lawn, just a few meters from my door. He stood absolutely still, like a statue, his gaze fixed on me. A chill ran down my spine, and my palms began to sweat. I pretended not to see him, lowering my head and trying to focus on my work, but my mind was in a turmoil. A few minutes later, I cautiously looked up again. He was still there, unmoving. I could almost feel his cold stare piercing through the glass, directly at me. I started to wonder if I was overreacting, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was terrifyingly real. As dusk settled that evening, the sky darkened and snow began to fall. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard a faint click from the front door. I froze. I should have been the only one home. I held my breath, then heard another click. Slowly, I crept to the front door and peered through the peephole. Outside, There was nothing but a blanket of white snow. I unlatched the chain and carefully opened the door. A cold gust of wind, laden with snowflakes, hit me. On the snowy path leading to my door, besides my own footprints, there was a clear set of men's shoe prints extending out towards the street. What chilled me to the bone was a small, dark red stain next to those prints, like dried blood. My stomach churned. I quickly shut the door, locked it with the chain, and added a few more locks. My hands shaking, I dialed 911, but hung up at the last second. What would I tell the police? There are footprints and a bloodstain outside my house. They'd probably think I was crazy or just overreacting. I couldn't sleep that night. The wind howled outside, and every gust sounded like whispered words. I turned on all the lights in the living room, but still felt the darkness closing in. Just as I was drifting off, a distinct knocking sound echoed through the house. It wasn't a regular knock, but a slow, heavy thump, thump, thump. My eyes shot open, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the security camera feed. The screen showed the man standing at my front door. He wasn't knocking, he was slamming his fist against the door, his face twisted in a disturbing smile. He seemed to be murmuring something, though I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the madness in his eyes. My hands trembling, I dialed 911, struggling to keep the tremor out of my voice. Someone's smashing my door. He's been lurking outside. He wants to get in. The calm voice of the dispatcher told me to stay calm, and that officers were on their way. I hung up, staring intensely at his distorted face on the screen, feeling time stretch endlessly. Suddenly, bang, a loud thud, and the front door shuddered violently, the frame groaning ominously. My heart seemed to skip a beat. He wasn't just knocking, he was battering the door. I heard heavy breathing from outside, followed by another muffled impact. Cracks began to spiderweb across the door panel, and I could see splinters of wood flying with each blow. I was frozen, unable to move, just watching as the cracks grew longer and deeper. The next second, bang. Another deafening crash, the lock let out a click, and the door panel buckled inward with a sickening scrape. I clearly saw an eye peeking through the widening gap, a bloodshot, frantic eye, staring directly at me through the crack. I was too terrified to make a sound, completely paralyzed. Just as that I was fully exposed and the door was about to give way, I heard the distant wail of police sirens. The sound grew louder, closer, like a gospel from the depths of hell. The pounding on the door abruptly stopped. I heard hurried footsteps receding, disappearing into the snowstorm. Seconds later, the sirens ceased outside my house, and the blinding flashes of police lights illuminated the living room through the window. The police rushed in, examining my door, which was severely damaged and the lock completely broken. They thoroughly searched the area around my house, but the man was gone. They asked if I knew him, and I shook my head, telling them I had no idea who he was. They took my report and assured me they would investigate immediately, as attempting to force entry into someone's home is a serious criminal offense. A few days later, the police called me. They had found the man in an abandoned warehouse about a mile from my house. He had set up a makeshift camp there. Inside, the police found several photos of me, my window where I worked, different angles of my house, even pictures of me sitting at my desk. They informed me that based on this evidence and my report, they had arrested him, and he would be facing charges of unlawful entry and property damage. I asked the officers if he had said anything. There was a moment of silence on the line before the officer said, "He just kept saying, 'I just wanted to talk to her.'" I hung up, feeling a wave of nausea. Even though he was arrested, I still didn't know who this man was or why he was so obsessed with me. Now 2 years later, I live in constant fear. Every sound outside my door sends a jolt through me. Even with him locked away, that feeling of being watched never truly leaves me. My house, once my safest sanctuary, has become my biggest fear. I don't know if he had accomplices, or if he's still, from some hidden corner, staring at my window. This wasn't my first time alone in the wilderness. As a nature photographer, I was used to solitude and silence. But what happened 3 years ago in the Bitterroot National Forest fundamentally changed my definition of alone. It was late January, and I had booked an old, remote ranger cabin for 4 days. My goal was to photograph snowy owls, which had been sighted in the area that winter in a rare migration. The cabin was rustic, just a bed, a wood-burning stove, and a table. No electricity, and certainly no cell signal. It was exactly what I wanted. The first day, I unpacked my gear, parked my truck next to the cabin, and felt secure and content in my own isolated, snow-covered kingdom. The forest was silent under a thick blanket of snow, beautiful and breathtaking. The strange feelings began on the second day. I was hiking deep into the forest, looking for a good vantage point. In a small clearing, I found something odd. Not animal tracks, but something man-made. They were small objects made from twigs, feathers, and tiny animal bones, tied together and hanging from the low branches of the pine trees. They were crude, like some kind of primitive totems or markers. I found them unsettling, but tried to rationalize them as some strange art left by previous hikers. That night, I was sitting in the cabin, reading by the light of a kerosene lamp while the stove blazed. Suddenly I heard a sound. It was faint, seeming to come from deep in the woods, a low, rhythmic humming. It was more of a vibration than a sound, a guttural resonance that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. I held my breath, listening intently, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the sound of the wind. I told myself it was just the acoustics of the wind moving through the trees. On the third day, the fear became concrete. On my way back to the cabin, on the exact path I had walked that morning, a new bone totem was stuck in the middle of the trail. It hadn't been there before. This was no coincidence. It was a warning, a clear message. Someone knew I was here, and they were watching me. Later that afternoon, I was scanning a distant ridge with my telephoto lens when a dark shape flickered in my view. It was the figure of a person, standing motionless at the edge of the trees, facing my direction. I immediately lowered my camera to look with my naked eye, but there was nothing there. My heart sank. I wasn't alone. I was being hunted. That night, I didn't light the stove, afraid the smoke would give away my position. I packed all my gear, deciding to leave at first light. I sat in the darkness and the cold, my hands wrapped tightly around my heaviest metal tripod. The minutes crawled by in absolute silence. Suddenly, tap, tap, tap. A soft but distinct tapping sound came from the window pane. It was slow and deliberate. My blood ran cold. I sat perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. The tapping stopped. A few moments later, a heavy thud hit the side of the cabin wall, as if someone had slammed their shoulder into it. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. The threat was right outside. The violence came without warning. A deafening crash, like an explosion, as a massive object slammed into the cabin's thick wooden door. Wood splintered and the door frame groaned in protest. A second impact followed, and the lock burst. The entire door flew inward and crashed to the floor. A tall figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the night. He was dressed in ragged clothes made from the patchwork pelts of different animals. His face was obscured by a wild, matted beard, and his eyes were lost in shadow. In his hand, he held a woodsman's axe, its blade glinting faintly in the gloom. He didn't speak. He just stared at me like a wild animal. In that instant, the instinct to survive overpowered my fear. As he took a step inside, I grabbed the kerosene lamp from the table and threw it at him. The glass shattered against his chest, and burning oil splashed across his furs. He let out a roar of shock and pain as his clothes caught fire. That was my chance. I bolted past him as he swatted at the flames and plunged out into the blizzard. I didn't just run blindly. I grabbed the snow shovel that had been leaning against the porch. I knew I needed a weapon before I could make it to my truck. He bellowed from behind me and gave chase. We were now locked in a life-or-death pursuit through the knee-deep snow. He was stronger and had an axe, but I knew the terrain I had spent the last 2 days scouting. I ran desperately toward where I had parked my truck, the snow and wind blinding me. In a small clearing, he caught up, swinging the axe. I raised the shovel with all my strength to block the blow. The clang of metal on metal echoed through the silent forest, the impact jarring my arms. He raised the axe again, and as I dodged, I shoved the wide scoop of the shovel into his face. He grunted and stumbled backward, giving me precious seconds. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I finally saw my truck, my last bastion of the civilized world. My fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the keys. The truck's lights cut through the darkness as I unlocked it. Just as I scrambled into the driver's seat, he emerged from the trees, a hulking demon against the white snow. I frantically turned the key, and the engine roared to life. He lunged for the door, but I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck skidded wildly before finding traction and shooting down the only road out. I drove until I got a single bar of cell service and called 911. The police later investigated the area. They found the destroyed cabin, the signs of a struggle, and the bizarre bone totems. Deep in the forest, they found a hidden, primitive shelter made of logs and hides, filled with animal traps and crude tools. But the man was gone. The official report concluded that I had likely stumbled into the territory of a dangerous and unstable squatter. They never found him. To this day, I can still feel his presence. He wasn't just some madman. The totems, the surveillance, the humming in the night, it was an ancient territorial ritual. I had trespassed into his world, and he had judged me by his rules. I escaped, but a part of me was left behind in that white wilderness. I know he is still out there, somewhere in that vast forest, waiting for the next person to wander too far.